Welcome to this episode of the Viking Virtual Resident Historian. It's part of our ongoing cultural enrichment program and our commitment to destination-focused learning. A series that takes you further with unique perspectives and intriguing insights. It analyzes and puts into context important chapters of world history. The Viking Virtual Resident Historian puts history at your fingertips. We hope you'll find this episode enriching.
Hello, I'm Paul Dawson. Today, we'll trace France's history over the centuries. Now, many of us will have studied some French history at school, but it's the rare student who has examined the whole history of France. In this two-part lecture, we will attempt to do just that. By way of introduction, on the screen is a detail from a painting by Eugène Delacroix. It's called Liberty Leading the People, and it's much loved by the French. It commemorates the July Revolution of 1830. That's the goddess of liberty, who's holding aloft the French tricolor flag, leading the French people to freedom. The painting represents notions that are close to every French person's heart, those of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, three cornerstones of French identity. And that is the subtitle of part one of our lecture, Liberty, Equality, and Brotherhood. Here is our roadmap for our entire journey. There are two parts. Part one covers France's early history, the medieval period, the reign of Louis XIV, and the Revolution of 1789. Part two begins in the early 19th century with the age of Napoleon. It then takes us through to the 20th century, including 2 world wars, and into France's modern era. We'll be coming back to this roadmap as we track our progress. Let's begin in southwestern France with the glorious cave paintings of prehistoric Lascaux. It was thanks to a lost dog called Robot that these were revealed to the world. In 1940, while they were looking for Robot, 2 boys stumbled upon the opening to a cave system that had remained hidden for millennia. Archaeologists subsequently discovered underground galleries with more than 150 wall paintings. Here we see horses, deer, and a very large and now extinct form of wild cattle called an auroch. While their purpose remains a mystery, we can assume now that they were not used for day-to-day living, because they were located in pitch-black galleries deep inside the caves. Whatever the case, scientists have now established that these paintings are some of humankind's earliest known artwork. But such surprising finds are not just restricted to Lascaux. Archaeologists in the late 19th century had already come across another equally stunning find, the Venus of Bassompouy. She's less than 2 inches tall, made from mammoth ivory, and she's even older than Lascaux. Exact dating of all prehistoric art remains quite controversial, but we believe that this beautiful figurine is around 25,000 years old. But what we do know is that she is considered one of the earliest, and possibly the very earliest, figurative representation of the human face. We'll now leave the mysteries of prehistory behind and travel forward in time to the 1st century BC, when the Romans swept up from the south. The France of Bassompouy and Lascaux had become a very different place. It was by now populated by tribes of warlike Celts who had migrated here from all across Europe. These were the famous Gauls, famous indeed for their aggressive fighting. They had proved this aggression earlier when they had sacked Rome in the year 390 BC. So when the Romans came across the Apennines, they had a grudge. They wanted revenge over what they called the barbarian Gauls. Roman legions arrived in 123 BC. getting as far as a town they called Aqua Sextier. It's now known to us today as Aix-en-Provence. And here they established the first of many Roman settlements. Despite stiff resistance from those feisty Gauls, by 52 BC, the Romans, with their superior weaponry and their organization, were able to pacify the whole of Gaul. And then they did what they always did when they arrived in a new territory. They built cities and brand new infrastructure, all financed from Rome, and the first of its kind in this region. There were roads, temples, theatres, and aqueducts that were so solid, many of them are still preserved today, leaving an astonishing legacy. Nîmes, in southern France, is considered an epicenter of Roman Gaul. The city presents some of the best examples of Roman structures today. On screen is La Maison Carrée, literally the square house, but in fact a perfectly proportioned, rectangular, Hellenistic-style temple. Next comes another example of the durable nature of Roman architecture, the aqueduct of the Pont du Gard. It's one of the best preserved structures of its kind and a marvel of precision engineering. Finally, we have the Nîmes Arena. It was built at the end of the 1st century, and it's smaller than its more famous counterpart in Rome, but it's better preserved and is still used today for performances. These are just 3 of the best-known examples of Roman buildings across the ancient territory of Gaul, and they're a testament to the Romans' superior engineering and construction skills, and perhaps also to their desire to leave a lasting legacy in the territories that they'd conquered. Rome's hold on its empire had begun to weaken by the 3rd century, and this was a time when Germanic tribes were migrating across Europe. One 3rd century Roman source mentions a barbarian tribe they called the Franks. They had exploited the weaknesses of an overstretched Roman Empire that was increasingly vulnerable to attack. But there was a problem. At first, the Franks spent as much time fighting each other as attacking the Romans. That is, until King Clovis I came along. Here he is. He's seen on a 9th century ivory book cover. He lived in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, and he was the first Frankish king to successfully unite belligerent Frankish tribes. Turning their collective might into action, the Franks then successfully defeated the Romans at the Battle of Soissons in 486, thus bringing an end to Roman rule in France. So, to the French, Clovis is seen as the father of what later becomes the modern nation of France. His unifying force brought together warring factions, and he began the fusion of individual kingdoms under one rule. There is one year in the 8th century that every French schoolchild knows by heart, and that is the year 732. It's when French hero Charles Martel defeated the invading Muslims at the Battle of Poitiers, circled here on our map. His victory changed the course of French history, and as a result, he also is seen as one of the founding fathers of France. Martel's victory was a crucial first act in the centuries-long war that was about to be waged by the Spanish. They only finally ousted the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. And who knows, without Martel's victory in 732, things could have turned out very differently, not just for France, but for the whole of Europe. And it is to Europe that we turn for our next chapter. We've already met Clovis, who united Frankish kingdoms in the 5th century. Now, 3 centuries later, let's meet another Frankish king, Charlemagne. He's also considered a founding father, not just of France, but of the whole of Europe. In fact, you could say that he was the first leader of the EU 1,200 years in advance. Charlemagne's success was to bring together warring kingdoms in Western and Central Europe under one banner. And this is why his effort has been compared to the 20th century European Union. His immense empire is shown on our map in pink. Its lands stretched from the Low Countries in the north to Italy in the south, and from Western France to Central Europe. Europe's founding father is now celebrated across the continent in statues, and he's also portrayed here in a stained glass window in Chartres Cathedral. Charlemagne was a statesman, but he was first and foremost a warrior. His life was dominated by battles, and he personally led his men into war right into his old age. He lived a very full and active life in every way. We know, for instance, that he had 10 wives and at least 18 children. But, like so many successful leaders, he left a messy family legacy. The unity that he'd fought for all his life began to fall apart rapidly after his death. His death was in 814, and he passed his empire to his son, Louis the Pious. And this is where the trouble began, because Louis subsequently tried to divide the territory equally among his own 3 sons. And it was when he died that the squabbles really broke out. These soon escalated into an all-out civil war. It was only in 843 that the Treaty of Verdun attempted to bring this to an end. This treaty tried to divide the empire fairly among the 3 contesting heirs. Here we see a 15th century illuminated manuscript called La Chronique des Rois de France, the Chronicle of French Kings. It shows Louis's 3 sons on the left. They're looking out over their 3 allocated kingdoms, West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia. And the map on the right also shows how this mighty empire was divided into 3 slices in a pretty arbitrary manner. It was this arbitrariness in the 9th century that had major repercussions that were felt for centuries to come. The borders of these kingdoms were inherently imperfect, and from their vulnerabilities came fracture lines that have lasted until the modern era. It's no exaggeration to say that they sowed the seeds for border disputes and wars right into the 20th century. Charlemagne is known as the father of Europe. He's also credited with having brought about Europe's earliest Renaissance, centuries before its more famous Italian namesake. In this early Renaissance, he and his successors encouraged a new focus on the creation and study of religious texts. And they established new centers of religious learning too, the abbeys. The Benedictine Abbey of Cluny is one of the earliest and the most influential in France. It was founded in the year 910. Over time, it became one of medieval Europe's most important spiritual centers. In fact, the 11th century Pope Urban II would declare Cluny to be the light of the world, and at its height, the abbey housed more than 10,000 monks. Some went on to become bishops and cardinals, and 4 Cluny abbots later became popes. Most of the abbey was destroyed during the French Revolution, so what we see today has largely been rebuilt. But there is one exception, seen here on the right, and that is the 15th century chapel that was intended as the burial chamber of Abbot Jean of Bourbon. The chamber was never completed, and it's perhaps for this reason that it escaped destruction. Cluny is important not only because it offers us a glimpse of life at one of France's earliest abbeys, but also because it represents France's spiritual and intellectual awakening. Cluny heralds the beginning of the medieval period. But what do we mean by the medieval period? There's no one clear date that announces the beginning of the Middle Ages. Some scholars use the year 1000 AD for this purpose. We, however, will use the founding of Cluny to mark the start of the medieval period in France. This was a time when borders were still fluid, and there were constant battles for control of territory. Europe's population was estimated at about 40 million at this time. It was still overwhelmingly feudal and subjugated to the twin forces of the Church and the monarchy. In medieval France, these two big institutions were increasingly at odds, fighting for dominance. And when you add cross-border rivalries to this, in particular those between the French and the English, you have that volatile mix that defines the medieval era in France. In our next section, we'll address three defining aspects of this period. First, the role of the papacy and its desire for total control of its subjects. Second, the rising frustrations of the French monarchy that set it on a collision course with the Vatican. And third, France's grinding and long drawn-out war with her neighbour across the Channel. Let's start with the Church. The beginning of the Middle Ages saw a wave of new church building in France. Between the 11th and the 14th centuries, more than 500 large churches and another 1,000 smaller churches were built across the land. To give this some context, in just 200 years, more stone was quarried in France than had been used in the whole of ancient Egypt. By the 13th century, there was a church or a chapel for every 200 people in France. These images trace the evolution of church architecture over a period of some 200 years. On the left, we have an example of the predominant style of the 11th century, the Romanesque. A squat, often compact facade, like the one seen here at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Poitiers, follows the form of an ancient Roman basilica. It is characterized by thick, heavy walls, rounded arches, and just a few small windows. But by the middle of the 12th century, a new style of architecture was coming into prominence, Gothic, demonstrated here by Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The contrast between these two styles could not be greater. Low-slung arches have given way to tall, pointed arches that draw the eye upwards towards heaven. Thanks to innovations in construction such as the flying buttress, ambitious medieval architects could now envisage tall, airy naves and soaring spires. There were also advances in stained glass. Now it was being manufactured in France, and it also brought new light and vivid colour to windows. The construction of these cathedrals was an affair of generations, with some taking more than a century to complete. Cities began to compete with each other, vying to see who could build the tallest cathedral. When Paris's Notre Dame spire reached 114 feet, Chartres went to 123 feet. Then Beauvais tried for 157 feet, but that was one step too far, and the nave collapsed in 1284. We should remember that this is an era when most of the population was illiterate. The great medieval cathedrals were therefore physical demonstrations of spirituality for the masses. Here they might glean visual lessons from the Bible, told in sculptured stone and in stained glass. But the growing influence of the Church set it on a collision course with another vital institution, the monarchy. The monarchy was the other critical institution in medieval France besides the Church. These two dominant establishments were eventually bound to clash. Relations between the French monarchy and the Vatican had long been a source of tension as Rome attempted to control all aspects of French life. And in the 14th century, these tensions boiled over. Things had started to go wrong as early as 1302, when Pope Boniface VIII issued a papal bull. In it, he declared that every human being should be subject to the Roman pontiff, and to him alone. This drew a sharp response from the French king, Philip IV. He called the Pope "your venerable conceitedness," and he stated that France would be nobody's vassal. Relations between these two men then deteriorated rapidly. Insults flew fast and furious. Then, in 1303, Philip escalated things further. He sent an army to Italy, where his men are said to have badly beaten the 73-year-old Pope. Boniface died a month later, and when the Vatican conclave for the election of his successor became deadlocked, Philip seized his chance. He acted to force the election of a French pope, and in this way he was able to organize the transfer of the papacy from the Vatican to Avignon in 1309. Here it remained for the next 67 years and through 7 French popes, all firmly under the influence of the French crown. Pope Clement V, who's seen here in the upper right, was the first of these usually docile French popes who were under the thumb of the French king. He mostly did as he was told and oversaw the construction of Avignon's Palais des Papes, shown here. But before long, competing factions were beginning to threaten the integrity of the church in Italy. Opposition to the French papacy had been simmering for some time, but in 1375 this turned into all-out conflict. This was the so-called War of the Eight Saints. It was between the last French pope, Gregory XI, seen here bottom right, and a coalition of Italian city-states led by Florence. Gregory saw that he just couldn't win, and he finally gave in to this mounting opposition. In 1377, he returned to Rome, where he died a year later. With this, the Avignon papacy came to an end. It had taken 67 years and 7 popes, but in the end, the pendulum seemed to have swung back in the Vatican's favor. In fact, this is not entirely true, because the period right after Gregory's death was one of schism and continuing conflict at the Vatican. But that's another story. Now let's look at the third defining element of the Middle Ages, war with neighboring England. To do this, we're moving to the 15th century, where we'll meet another French hero, Joan of Arc. We've already met King Clovis, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne, heroes of the 5th, 8th, and 9th centuries. But the French venerate our newest hero, Joan, much more than these others. Known as the Maid of Orleans, she's held up to this day as a symbol of French courage and fortitude, and she's even become the nation's patron saint. Joan was born in the final years of the 100 Years' War, that long, simmering series of hostilities between the thrones of England and France. Kings on both sides of the Channel claimed rights to rule in each other's country. And when Joan arrived on the scene at the end of the war, England was on a winning streak. The French had been crushed at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. So if anyone was going to emerge as a victor from the never-ending hostilities of the 100 Years' War, it would seem to be the English. But Joan changed that. She led the French to a series of victories, of which the most remarkable was the Siege of Orleans in 1428 and 1429. That battle is shown here in a 15th century illuminated manuscript. Joan had been sent by the French king to rally her countrymen, who were trapped inside the town of Orleans. Her success was immediate, and the siege collapsed after only 9 days. This was a watershed victory and a turning point for the French. It changed the course of the war, and it paved the way for France's final victory in 1453. Joan, however, had been captured in 1430. She was put on trial for some 70 charges, among them witchcraft, heresy, and dressing like a man. She was pronounced guilty in 1431 and burned at the stake at the age of only 19. This elevated her to an almost mythical status in the eyes of the French. She was canonized in 1920, and her statue is now found in town squares all across the country. We'll leave the Middle Ages and travel to the 17th century. Here we will meet the larger-than-life character of Louis XIV. We'll see how his excesses sowed the seeds for the revolution that was to come. Plenty had happened in the preceding 2 centuries that we won't go into here. But I will mention one thing, and that was the selection of Paris by King Francois I as his royal seat in the 16th century. This had cemented the city's role as the cultural, political, and economic hub of France. And it is in Paris that Louis XIV bursts onto the scene. And here he is, in all his finery, in one of his most famous portraits. This was painted in 1701 by Hyacinthe Rigaud. It shows him quite literally looking down his nose at us. With his hand on his hip, he stands easily on the legs of a ballet dancer. He had danced in his youth, and he considered his legs to be one of his best features. I might add that this was Louis's favourite painting of himself. He even had it placed over his throne. In his absence, the painting served as his proxy, and no courtier was ever allowed to turn his back on this painting. Does that begin to offer us any clues as to what kind of man we're dealing with? To give him his due, we must remember that more than any other French king, Louis XIV transformed the monarchy during what was a 72-year reign, still the longest in European history. He ushered in what's known as the Grand Siècle, the Great Century. This was a golden age during which his court at Versailles became the centre for art and culture. His rule also saw him annexing neighbouring territories, and this established France as the dominant power of 17th century Europe. Now, did he actually utter those immortal words, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state? We don't know for sure, but what is clear is that he saw himself as a divine ruler. He had absolute control over his subjects, and he used this quite cleverly to keep France's traditionally fractious nobility under his thumb, governing in a highly centralized manner from Versailles. We should note that when he was born in 1638, France was more or less insolvent. Weakened by years of war with Spain, she also suffered from internal conflicts against the Huguenots. Louis came to the throne at the age of 4 with Cardinal Jules Mazarin as his regent. But when Mazarin died, Louis immediately declared that he alone would govern, and he proceeded to centralize everything around himself. One of his most crucial initiatives was his feat in disempowering the nobility. How did he do this? Well, he attracted them to the court with the promise of an opulent lifestyle, and then he effectively enslaved them in an endless round of pomp, ceremony, and ritual. Occasionally, he would even stipulate that new clothes were required for a certain event. You can imagine the mad scramble for local tailors and dressmakers that ensued. His extravagances were legion. Here's a dinner menu from 1682. It reads as follows: 4 soups, 1 whole pheasant stuffed with truffles, 1 whole partridge, duck, chicken, salad, mutton, ham, patisserie, fresh fruit, and finally, fruit compote and preserves. Now, this wasn't the menu for a state dinner, no. This was just an average weeknight meal at home for the monarch. I should add that he never dined alone. He would have enjoyed this marathon meal in front of an audience of astonished onlookers. Does it come as any surprise that he suffered from diabetes, gout, and other assorted ailments? Nevertheless, he lived to the ripe old age of 76. During his long reign, literature, art, and architecture flourished. The playwright Molière and the composer Lully, among others, benefited from their relationship with the king. But if his domestic life was extravagant, consider for a moment his foreign policy, which was equally costly. During his reign, he essentially emptied the coffers of his treasury by waging war. First, there was the war against the Dutch in the 1670s. Then, the War of the Grand Alliance towards the end of the century. And finally, the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714. France emerged from these conflicts weakened and penniless. And crucially, the once untouchable institution of her monarchy was significantly diminished. We've seen that Louis XIV was not shy of spending money on himself, but in so doing, he left an incredible legacy for his country. No question that Versailles was his greatest work. This started as a humble hunting lodge on the outskirts of Paris, but it was transformed over 40 years into this dazzling palace with 700 rooms, 2,000 windows, and no less than 67 staircases. It became the epicenter of Louis's court and home to hundreds of noble families that were drawn into the Sun King's orbit. Louis le Vau was its first architect. He was followed by Jules Hardouin-Mansart, whose masterpieces included the Royal Gate, the Royal Chapel, and the Hall of Mirrors shown here. Building the gardens was another monumental task that lasted over 40 years. These were designed by André Le Nôtre, and they included fountains and parterres set in formal symmetrical patterns. While everything inside the palace was designed to draw attention to its one most illustrious inhabitant, everything outside in the garden was designed to draw one's eye away from the palace to the horizon. And finally, as we can see from this slide, there was the not inconsiderable role of the interior decorator. This was Charles Lebrun. He personally supervised the production of paintings, sculptures, and other decorations over some 3 decades. Now, these marvels of Versailles were a wonderful way for Louis to remind his people, as if they ever needed reminding, that everything was all about him. The palace and the rituals and all that endless pomp demonstrated that he was God's unquestioned representative on earth. The monarchy was all-powerful, and it could not be challenged. Or could it? Let's fast forward to the 18th century. Louis XV is now on the throne, and things have been changing. The dual pillars of the church and the monarchy were now being challenged by a new movement, the Enlightenment. Here we see a painting of Marie-Thérèse Joffrin in her salon on Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris. Every week, she hosted parties like this one for artists and philosophers of her day. These salons provided a place for discourse and debate away from the royal court, and they became a model for the Enlightenment. This was a big change because it meant that thinkers were no longer constantly looking over their shoulders. They were free to question those unshakable pillars of the church and the monarchy. Enlightenment thinkers began a debate on man's role as an independent being. Among those thinkers were René Descartes, with his immortal phrase, "I think, therefore I am," and Voltaire, who wrote, judge a man by his questions and not by his answers. And then there was Montesquieu, who wrote, "To become truly great, one must stand with the people and not above them." A few years ago, such thinking would have been heresy. This was the language of revolution. If the seeds of rebellion were sown during the Enlightenment, then in 1789 they blossomed into all-out revolution. As background, Louis XVI is now on the throne. To be fair, he had inherited a country whose coffers were almost empty, thanks to his predecessor's expensive domestic and foreign policy tastes. But he just made things worse. First of all, he demonstrated absolutely no aptitude for kingship. Not only was he timid, indecisive, and awkward in manner, he also much preferred to stay away from his people at home with his wildly unpopular and hugely extravagant wife, Marie Antoinette. Second, under his poor leadership, social inequalities had increased sharply. His government only taxed the merchant and peasant classes. The nobility and the clergy, already the wealthiest part of French society, didn't pay any tax at all. The working classes clearly suffered because of this, and that suffering was exacerbated by decades of poor harvests and rocketing bread prices. There was palpable unrest across the nation. So, here we have a poorly prepared and unpopular king with a barely functioning government facing an increasingly angry population. The king was desperate. The only avenue he had left was to convene an antiquated form of assembly that dated back to the 13th century. It was called the États Généraux, the Estates General. And this turned out to be a disaster. This ancient assembly had its roots in feudal times. It was made up of representatives from 3 different levels of French society, or 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy. The second was the nobility, and the third were ordinary members of society. Here was the problem. There were obviously far more ordinary people than clergy or nobility in France, but each of these 3 estates had equal voting rights. Representatives from the third estate rightly feared that the nobility and the clergy would block any attempt at reform. So they met on their own, in advance, and without the king's permission. Then they demanded not just a new and more representative assembly, but a new constitution. This was an act of civil disobedience. It was only a matter of days before rioters were storming the Bastille, as seen here in the painting by Jean-Pierre Houel. It was July the 14th, 1789. The monarch's absolute hold over his subjects was crumbling. The French Revolution had begun in earnest. July the 14th was a triumph for the people of France, and today it's France's National Day. But back in 1789, this triumph led to a period of intense instability. In the anti-royalist fervor that followed, thousands were executed. A 9-member so-called Committee of Public Safety began the systematic elimination of public enemies. This committee was supposed to defend France against the enemies of the Republic, but instead it pursued its own citizens in what became known as the Reign of Terror. More than 300,000 suspected enemies of the Republic were arrested. 17,000 died by guillotine, and possibly a further 10,000 in prison. This reign of terror was masterminded by Maximilien Robespierre, seen here top right. He'd played an important part in the early days of the revolution, but now he was taking matters into his own hands. He expanded the powers of the committee, suspended the right to a public trial, and then he turned on his own colleagues. At one famously bad-tempered committee meeting attended by Robespierre and fellow revolutionary Bertrand Barrère, seen here top left, he was said to have shouted at his fellow committee members, "Who are you, insolent pygmies? I wouldn't even give you a farmyard to govern." By 1793, the balance of power had shifted so far towards Robespierre that he was literally getting away with murder, as was the case in the execution of his fellow committee member, Georges-Jacques Danton, seen here bottom right. Danton's only mistake was to speak up against excessive violence. This febrile atmosphere is perhaps best summed up by the death of radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat, who's seen here bottom left. He was murdered in his bathtub at the hands of a crazed aristocratic sympathizer, and he's now recognized as a revolutionary martyr and icon. As for the guillotine, this new killing machine was invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin. He thought that it was a more humane way of execution than traditional hanging. Guillotines were set up in public squares across the country, and their use rapidly became a public spectacle. Some people even attended on a daily basis, notably the famous tricoteurs, the knitters who would bring their knitting to while away the time between executions. Not surprisingly, the guillotine invited some classic gallows humor. It became popularly known as la veuve, which means the widow, or even more macabre as the rasoir national, or the national razor. In the immediate aftermath of July the 14th, Louis and Marie Antoinette tried to live their lives as normal, protected behind the walls of Versailles. But that wasn't to last. They were taken to the Tuileries Palace in central Paris. Was this for their protection, or was it just to keep them under better surveillance? Whatever the case, they tried to flee in June 1791. But their escape failed when a citizen is said to have recognized the king's face from his likeness on a banknote. They were brought back to Paris, and here Louis was officially arrested, stripped of all of his titles, and remanded in prison, with the new name Citizen Louis Capet, his original family name. He was then indicted of high treason, quickly convicted, and guillotined on the 21st of January, 1793. His wife, Marie Antoinette, survived a little while longer. Remember that she'd never been very popular. This painting on the left shows her at the height of her powers, and it's not hard to see why she had always been seen as frivolous and out of touch. Recall that famous phrase attributed to her, qu'il mange de la brioche, or as we know it, let them eat cake. When she said that, her countrymen could not even afford to buy a loaf of bread, never mind brioche, which was made of butter and eggs, real luxuries that they could only dream of. In the end, they came after her too. She was indicted in 1793 and transferred to the infamous conciergerie. Here she lost her royal title, becoming simply prisoner number 280. At her trial, however, she remained dignified and calm. A court transcript tells us that she almost always kept a calm and assured demeanor, running her fingers on the arm of her chair as though she was playing the pianoforte. Facing her prosecutors, she's said to have told them, "I was a queen, and you took away my crown, a wife, and you killed my husband, a mother, and you deprived me of my children. My blood alone remains. Take it, but do not make me suffer long." And before dawn, on October the 16th, 1793, she heard her sentence, death by guillotine. That same day, she was shorn of her hair, and taken by open cart through jeering crowds to the Place de la Révolution. That's a contemporary drawing of her in that cart, and at 12:30 precisely, she was executed. She was just 2 weeks shy of her 38th birthday. Let there be no doubt the revolutionaries were in charge and the monarchy had been abolished. How the mighty have fallen indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of part 1 of our history of France. In part 2, with the revolution still playing out on the streets of Paris, we will meet a young officer from Corsica. He's been working his way up the ranks of France's 1st Artillery Regiment. And he's about to burst onto the scene, permanently changing the landscape of France. Please join us for part 2. Thank you.